presentation. Don't worry trying to write them down. If you want to get a copy of the sources as PDF, please email the Merida English Library and you can get that from Aranza.
So let's start then. Today we are concentrating on 6 explorers. The first will be Bernal Díaz del Castillo, a conquistador. Then we continue with 3 priests, Fray Tomás de la Torre, Fray Diego de Delanda, and Fray Antonio de Ciudad Real. And we will end with 2 English guys, William Dampier and James Cook.
What we are trying to do is to answer 4 questions. These are the guidelines of our inquiry. Who was this traveler, this explorer? To do a contextualization of the trips. Why did they come here? Why was their motivation? What were the contexts? And an evaluation of what their contribution to the history of the peninsula.
Let's begin then with Bernal Díaz del Castillo, who is best known as eyewitness, chronicler of the conquest of the Aztecs. Born in Medina del Campo, he came from a respectable, also not prosperous family, and his motivation for joining Spain's adventures overseas was probably to acquire wealth and fame as a conquistador. He had to finance by himself his trip to Cuba, the point of departure for all the Spanish grounds expeditions in that time, into what we know now as Latin America. From there, he embarked in the first 3 explorations of the New World's mainland. Led by Francisco Hernández de Córdoba, the Spaniards inspected the coastal area from what today is Quintana Roo to Campeche. Among other interesting descriptions by Diaz from this trip are those presenting the layout of a Maya village.
A short distance ahead was a small plaza with 3 houses built of masonry, which served as temples and oratories. They contained many pottery idols and some necklaces and 3 diadems, all made of inferior gold. When we had seen the gold, we felt well content at having discovered such a country.
The first sight of this land that the foreigners took was that of the flat northeast shore of Yucatán. On March 1st, 1517, Bernal Díaz del Castillo wrote,
"We observed a large town." There we are. "We observed a large town standing back about 2 leagues from the coast. And as we had never seen such a large town in the island of Cuba, nor in Hispaniola, we named it Great Cairo."
By the way, until now, it is still unclear which Maya city he was referring to. A few days later, Diaz reports their first contact with the Maya people, who came on canoes and were invited to board the ships. It was a friendly encounter in which they gave colorful bead collars to the natives as presents. However, a few days later, as the conquistadors accepted an invitation from a Maya leader or cacique to visit his town, they were assaulted by warriors.
The Indians attacked us in great haste and fury, and began to shoot with such a skill that the first flight of arrows wounded 15 soldiers. These warriors wore armor made of cotton reaching to the knees and carried lances and shields, bows and arrows, slings and many stones. However, thank God, we soon put them to flight when they felt the sharp edge of our swords and the effect of our guns and crossbows, and many of them fell dead.
In this passage, we already see the pattern that the encounters between the Spanish and the Maya will follow for years. The first, the Spaniards, had to land to explore and to get supplies such as water or food. Initially, they were received by the Maya in what they thought was a friendly manner. The Maya, on their part, wished to drive away the foreigners, so they invited them to get off the ships and brought them into their territory to attack them. It came mostly to combats in which the Spaniards were usually overpowering, but suffered nevertheless severe losses and injuries. For example, Diaz narrates a crucial battle they had close to the port of Champotton.
All our soldiers received 2 or 3 arrow wounds. 3 of them had their throats pierced by lance. Our captain was bleeding from many wounds and many were lying dead. Me? They struck 3 times. 1 arrow wounded me dangerously on the left side, piercing through the ribs.
Because of the fierce defense presented by the Maya and the losses faced by the Spanish, this first expedition was interrupted. The conquistadors returned to Cuba, where Hernández de Córdoba died as a result of his wounds. So why didn't the Spanish give up? I think it's clear because of the initial reports of gold. However, the following 2 expeditions confirmed that the Yucatecan gold was only found in small amounts and it was of poor quality. The good one was imported from central Mexico. This explains why after 1519, the conquistador Hernán Cortés centered his efforts on the Aztecs, and the Spanish crown did not show major interest in the peninsula anymore. Only the adelantado Francisco Montejo and his family remained at work continuously in Yucatan. And this was not an easy task, as we know. It wasn't until the 1540s that the Spanish gained ground. The second Yucatecan adventure in which Diaz took part in 1518, a year later, was under Juan de Grijalva's command and followed mostly the same route as the first one. Interesting about this exploration is the report of the first religious conversions of Maya leaders into the Catholic religion. 1 year later, Hernán Cortés led the third expedition into Yucatan, in which Diaz again participated. This mission turned out to be very important for the later conquest of the Aztec Empire. The roots of this story go back to 1511, as 18 survivors of the Santa Maria de la Barca, a caravel that sank in the Caribbean, made it to Cap Cartouche in the northeastern corner of the Yucatan Peninsula. Within a short period of time, 16 of them either died or were sacrificed by the Maya. As Cortés anchored his ships in Cozumel in 1519, he heard that 2 Spanish were kept captive on the mainland. He negotiated the release with the Maya lords, while the Catholic priest Jerónimo de Aguilar joined his co-nationals. The seaman Gonzalo Guerrero decided to stay. Diaz reports that Guerrero made his decision because he had already integrated into the local society.
I am married and have 3 children, and the Indians look on me as a cacique and captain in wartime. You go and God be with you. But I have my face tattooed and my ears pierced. What would the Spanish say should they see me in this guise?
After overcoming several obstacles, Aguilar made it to the Spanish ships. Here, Diaz tells us how the conquistadors saw him.
They could not distinguish him from an Indian as he was naturally brown and he had his hair shorn like an Indian slave and carried a paddle on his shoulders. He had on a rag old cloak and the worst loincloth with which he covered his nakedness.
While in Yucatan, Jerónimo de Aguilar had learned native languages and customs. He became a translator, and because of these skills, he was instrumental for the downfall of central Mexico, or the Aztecs, 2 years later in 1521. And what happened to Diaz after the conquista? Years later, the Spanish crown rewarded him for his services by assigning him property. For a long time, he served as governor of Coatzacoalcos in Veracruz. And in 1541, he settled in Guatemala and was appointed governor of the first Spanish capital of that country, now named Antigua. He died there in 1584, being almost 90 years old. Diaz began writing his opus magnum, Historia Verdadera de la Conquista de la Nueva España, or The True History of the Conquest of New Spain, in 1552. However, the first edition did not come out but until 80 years later in 1632. His intentions for writing were to counteract other accounts by diverse historians and eyewitnesses that, according to Diaz, were highly inaccurate, and to bring notice to the accomplishments of other less known conquistadors like him, instead of Cortes just taking all credit for it. Until our days, the Historia Verdadera is still the most important book for understanding the history of the first encounters between the Spanish, the Maya, and the Aztecs. Although Diaz probably exaggerated some of the actions of the latter in order to justify the brutality of the colonial forces, he also considered the local culture with certain respect and objectivity. The presence and work of Díaz del Castillo in Yucatán is unique because, as we mentioned, he came as a soldier and turned into a chronicler. After him, most of those who left testimonies of the perceptions of Yucatán in the early colonial times were priests.
The first one of this group that we will present today will be Fray Tomás de la Torre. A Spanish Dominican friar, he was part of the group that came with Bishop Bartolomé de las Casas on his journey to southern Mexico in 1544. Although very little is known about him, he left a chronicle entitled Diario del Viaje desde Salamanca, España, hasta Ciudad Real, Chiapas, 1544 to 1545, in which he included his impressions about the Yucatan Peninsula. His writings reveal the harsh conditions in which the colonists lived during the first decades in the so-called New World, which was not really new, as we know. On January 6, 1544, Tomás de la Torre recorded the arrival of the clergy to the port of Campeche, where there were barely 500 people living, 500 houses, 13 barrios. Some of his observations are interesting from an anthropological perspective because they refer to daily life. Among other subjects, he reports dressing codes, saying that the native commoners used loincloths and that the caciques that had already been baptized wore jackets and more elaborated Spanish-style outfits. With regards to food, he considered that
the tortillas, if well prepared and hot, would be fit for any Spaniard to eat.
the Spanish who lived in the city of Campeche did not have comfortable accommodations, but only rude frontier furnishings. They did not even have beds for the bishop and his group. Therefore, the priest wrote,
"We slept in the church on the bare ground, with only our habits to cover."
His perceptions about a Maya village are also interesting.
The town is without order, a house here, another one there, covered with straw.
This is probably one of the aspects in which we can see the influence of Spanish urbanism. Nowadays, almost all Maya villages show some form of a grid layout, even if sort of loose.
So after this Dominican friar, we move on to the Franciscans. Okay. Fray Diego Delanda, he is probably the most controversial figure that we will present today. He was born in Cifuentes in Spain in 1524 into a noble family. He arrived in Yucatan in 1549, quickly learned Yucatec Maya, and formed close relationships with elite native families. He got important assignments, such as to plan and build the impressive mission of Izamal. Among his qualities, it is said that he was full of energy, a curious traveler, a good preacher, and a great observer of native customs. It is also reported, however, that he had a tendency towards extreme uprightness, could be stubborn, and always justified himself. He served the church in Yucatan during 2 long periods of time. Delanda died here in 1579. So why is this clergyman so controversial until our days? On one side, as acting bishop in 1562, he ordered to burn all Maya codices with hieroglyphs painted on deerskin, and to destroy ceremonial objects such as idols, a large variety of small sculptures and vessels collected all over the country. In this action, known as the Auto de Fe de Mani, Landa destroyed treasured and irreplaceable values. Additionally, he chased, tortured, and condemned indigenous people who did not give up their old religious beliefs and practices. On the other hand, the cleric collected all kinds of information about this culture in his famous Relación de las Cosas de Yucatán, or An Account of Things in Yucatan, the most complete report about Yucatan and the Maya, including the environment, customs, sciences, beliefs, and history. According to author Richard Perry,
this manuscript is a surprisingly sympathetic account of the land, its people, and customs that reveal a deep attachment to Yucatan and its people, although there is little hint of regret for his actions and the traumatic events that Yucatan endured as a result.
Landa wrote his manuscript in Spain as a justification, as he was called back to stand trial for conducting an illegal inquisition. Nevertheless, at the end, the clergyman was not convicted and returned to Yucatan, appointed as the second official bishop. Landa justified the destruction of Maya texts in his Relaciones.
We found a large number of books, and as they contained nothing in which there were not to be seen a superstition and lies of the devil, we burned them all. Yet,
the bishop was also curious about the Maya hieroglyphic script itself and even attempted to translate it. Delanda asked his reliable informants to write down the glyphic symbols corresponding to each of the letters of the Spanish alphabet in the belief that there ought to be a one-to-one correspondence between them. You can see it here on the screen, the famous Landa alphabet. Although he noticed that the set contained apparent inconsistencies and duplicates that he was unable to explain, Delanda faithfully reproduced them in his account. Beginning in the 1950s with the groundbreaking work of Soviet linguist Yuri Knorosov, it became clear that what Delanda had compiled was not an alphabet, but a syllabary. Today we know that the bishop created a valuable record of the ancient Maya writing system, which, despite its inaccuracies, was to prove instrumental in its decipherment. Delanda's original manuscript has been lost for centuries. What we have is only an abridgment that has undergone several iterations by various copyists. The existent version was produced around 1660. This was rediscovered by the French priest Charles-Étienne Brasseur de Beaubout, who published the manuscript 1864 in a bilingual French-Spanish edition. You can see the book here. Today, we find Delanda's work translated into many languages and in almost every bookshop. For those interested in a historical perspective of how the old Maya city of Tijo was transformed into Merida, the Relaciones is an irreplaceable book. The bishop wrote, for example, about the reuse of ancient material into colonial constructions.
This former Mayan building was given to us, the Franciscans, by the Adelantado Montejo. Since it has become much overgrown, we cleared it out and, using the stone, built a fair monastery of masonry and a fine church which we named for the Mother of God. There was so much stone that the buildings on the south and opposite sides were still whole. So great was the abundance that we gave much stone to the Spaniards for their houses, especially for the doors and windows.
Given that the book presents the traditional vision of the invaders, its perspective on the conquest is biased. If we think about how the indigenous people in whole Latin America have been treated from the conquest until our days, some of Delanda's sentences sound really cynical.
The Indians have not lost, but rather gained much by the arrival of the Spaniards. They live incomparably more like civilized beings. They have more help in their labors and in the lighting of them because, in the words of the philosopher, art aids nature. The Maya have received without payment things that can neither be bought nor deserved, the Christian justice and peace in which they live now.
Even more astounding for us is that today you will find people who agree with this version.
Now we come to another priest, Antonio de Ciudad Real, who, according to the archaeologist Marshall Seville, is one of the great figures of the literary and ecclesiastical story of Yucatan. We would add that his thoughts and observations about the Maya ruin site of Uxmal are highly valuable. Born in Spain, de Ciudad Real arrived in 1573 to Yucatan as secretary to the already mentioned Diego Delanda. Rapidly, he learned Maya and that fluently and showed great curiosity for the way people lived in this region. Later, the Ciudad Real became the right hand of Fray Alonso Ponce de Leon, who was the commissioner to the Franciscan provinces in New Spain. He accompanied this high-rank cleric in a very long and dangerous inspections they did of all 166 Franciscan missions in the colony. These endeavors lasted 5 years and gave the Ciudad Real enough interesting material to write his travel narrative, now known, I'm going to read it in English, but this is the short version, Curious and Learned Treatise of the Splendors of New Spain, published in 1872. The full original title you can see on the screen. At the end of his trip with Ponce de Leon, the Ciudad Real returned to Europe, where he wrote the book. And then one more time in 1592, he crossed the Atlantic and spent the rest of his life here in Yucatan. He actually passed away in June 5th, 1617 here in Merida's monastery. The author Richard Perry values Antonio de Ciudad Real as a sharp observer of life in a then underdeveloped country, in an underdeveloped colony, actually. The friar's description of his visit to Merida in 1588 offers a snapshot of how this new colonial society was being formed overseas.
The city of Merida has 300 Spanish residents, of whom some are encomenderos, who hold Indian towns in encomienda, others merchants and traders. Others are officials and city people who support themselves by their haciendas, which are cattle ranches and some of sheep and goats. They are all well-spoken people of good bearing, very devoted to our state, but not rich.
Antonio de Ciudad Real witnessed the construction process of the first cathedral to be built in America, the Cathedral the San Ildefonso in Merida. Its creation started 1562, and it is thanks to the labor of hundreds of Maya people that from the stones of a close-by ancient temple, a new magnificent structure was created.
It is being built very solidly, with 3 naves of stone and mortar, with ornamented arches about columns of masonry, with chapels on the sides, and with very tall, massive, and beautiful towers, which were already finished, as were the side naves.
But the Ciudad Real was not only interested in buildings and urbanism, he was also very curious about nature and its products. Thanks to him, we have one of the earliest reports of the richness of Yucatecan honey and the method by which it was originally produced, which was in hollowed out wooden tree trunks, sort of like the ones you see in this image. And this is what the Ciudad Real wrote about.
There is much and very good honey, of which great quantities are carried in jars to New Spain by sea. And there it hardens like a loaf of sugar and is highly esteemed. The bees that produce it are very small, little larger than common flies. They do not sting like those of Castile, and thus they easily remove the comb from the hives, which are small and not of cork, of which there is none in the country, but of the trunk of certain trees.
But If there is only one thing that you take with you today about why Antonio de Ciudad Real is important as a source, maybe you want it to be the description he gave us about Uxmal, the ancient site of Uxmal, that he visited in 1588. This is exceptional, and not only because we just have a few 16th century accounts of such subjects, but also because it is by far the most significant and all-encompassing of all of them. As an example, we have the following description of the west side building of the nunnery quadrangle in Uxmal.
The building on the west is very elegant and beautiful on the outside facade, which looks on the plaza, since serpents made of stone extend over the whole of it, so as to enclose it from end to end. There are also many figures of men and idols, other figures of monkeys and of skulls, and different kinds of shields, all carved in stone. There are also over the doors of the rooms some statues of stone with sticks in their hands, and there are bodies of naked Indians with the old-fashioned loincloth of all New Spain, by which it is shown that these buildings were built by Indians.
Mm-hmm. To keep the importance of this inspection in perspective, we have to remember that the next comparable report in terms of fullness and accuracy will not be authored but until 250 years later. By then, the described building had already partially collapsed. What we enjoy now is actually a reconstructed and restored structure, but not the original. Besides his verbal portrayal of Uxmal, we would add, of great value is the fact that the cleric, already in the 16th century, advanced hypotheses about the origins of that ancient city that will take centuries to confirm. First, he asserted that it had been built by the ancestors of the contemporary Maya, and not as many later travelers speculated, who said that maybe it was the Phoenicians or it was the lost tribes of Israel. A second, the Ciudad Real proposed that the ruins were erected around the year 700 AD. Although not fully correct, we know that this is an estimate that it's actually close enough. And at last, the priest suggested one of the causes of the Maya collapse in Yucatán.
It might be easily suspected that these buildings were depopulated for want of water.
The drought, as one of the major causes of the collapse, is today a widely accepted theory in the scholarly community.
But not only clergymen came to colonial Yucatán. By the 17th and 18th centuries, there were also adventurers, military men, and even pirates. How so? Although officially only the Spanish crown could authorize people to come to Nueva España, other countries were also trying to extend overseas, either legally or illegally. England was one of Spain's main competitors in the then recently discovered continent. There were official expeditions sent by the crown, but also independent ones. The English detected that the Yucatan Peninsula was one of New Spain's weak points, because there were large extensions of jungle still not settled, and the Spanish military forces were incapable to defend them. The main points of interest for the new invaders were the Campeche Bay in the west side on the peninsula and what is today Belize on the east coast. There, English pirates settled illegally, both to attack Spanish ships and to profit from the cutting of logwood trees.
And this is how we come to William Dampier, a voyager who had an extraordinary life path. English explorer, buccaneer, and naturalist, he was probably born in East Coker in 1652. He grew up in a poor family of farmers and received only a basic education. With 17 years of age, he served as a cabin boy on a ship and sailed to France, later to Canada. Then he signed up to a trip to Southeast and East Asia, the so-called East Indies, and would end up taking part in the war at sea between England and Holland in 1673, You can see all this in the chronology on the screen. A year later, he embarked towards the West Indies, where he worked as foreman in a plantation in Jamaica, but he got bored rather quickly, so he left. After a short episode with a commercial boat in the Caribbean Sea, he joined an adventure loading logwood in the west side of the Yucatán Peninsula. And this was the first of his 2 stays here, both with native people and with loggers and pirates of different nationalities around the Laguna de Terminos. We will come back to these trips that took place in 1675 and 1676. We continue with the biography of this interesting character. By 1679 to 1691, Dampier joined consecutively several actions, which at the end added up to his first circumnavigation of the world. He actually did 3. Initially, he joined the crew of a pirate ship with the failed objective to conquer Panama City. Subsequently, the buccaneers raided Spanish settlements in Peru and Chile. After a short stay in the state of Virginia in the USA, where he thought he wanted to settle, he quickly came back to his life as a pirate. His adventures then took him through a 6,000-mile voyage that started in Mexico and went through the Philippines, Vietnam, China, Malaysia, and New Holland, which is now Australia. It was also during this trip that at a certain point, Dampier was abandoned with a few other sailors on a small island. But resourcefully, they figured out how to put together some sort of a boat and were able to make it all the way to Sumatra, action which until now is considered a great accomplishment. After all these endeavors, Dampier returned 1691 to England with a bounty of highly valuable information about the people and cultures he came in contact with, such as data and samples of flora and fauna, records of trade winds and currents of the seas where he had traveled, but he was financially broke. The following years see him back on board of trade ships, but this time in the West Indies. Moreover, he weathered successfully a legal process against him for charges of insurrection. Back again in London, again in 1697, he published his book, A New Voyage Round the World, which became a popular sensation as a travel and adventure book. Additionally, it established Dampier as a scientific observer and a scientific worker. He could actually look at things and describe them well. This success opened new doors for him. His next 2 assignments came directly from the Royal Navy and had as an objective to acquire knowledge. If in 1698 he was still a buccaneer, a year later, as the Admiralty gave Dampier command of the warship HMS Roebuck, he was the leader of an officially scientific expedition departing towards the east coast of what is now Australia. Under the assignment to discover things that might be of advantage to England, he was given free hand to probe whatever he wanted. And Dampier did really well. He investigated the entire range of animals, plant, and men. However, on his return, he was court-martialed for cruelty against a crew member. As a result, his compensation for this voyage was shortened, and he was discharged from the Royal Navy. In need of money again, Dampier returned to his activities as a pirate all around the world, which apparently he carried out quite successfully for the next 8 years until 1711. He died in London, probably in 1715, but the exact dates and circumstances remain unknown. What a life. But what we're interested in here are his experiences and offerings to the history of Yucatán, compiled in the book Dos Viajes a Campeche. Here you see the German edition from 1703 of this book, And one of the chapters is Dos Viajes a Campeche. It's actually not a chapter, it's a part of it that is entitled Dos Viajes a Campeche. In Spanish, you can find it as a separate book. Here, he provided an insightful report of how Campeche looked in 1676.
Campeche is a fair town, standing on the shore in a small bending of land. And it is the only town on all this coast down to Veracruz that stands open to the sea. It makes a fine shoe being built all with good stone. The houses are not high, but the walls are very strong, the roofs flattish after the Spanish fashion and covered with pentile. There is a strong fort at one end, planted with many guns, where the governor resides with a small garrison to defend it. Formerly, this place was the scale of the whole logwood trade, which is therefore still called Palo de Campeche.
Another set of contributions are his records and observations of the logwood cutting activities in the western side of the peninsula. In them, Dampier describes the work anthropology of the log cutters, who usually came from different nations and in many cases were pirates, at least part of their life. The value of this is twofold. First, it is a first-hand experience because Dampier lived and worked as one of them for months. And a second, there exists almost no other written documents about these illegal activities of log cutting in Campeche. As background, logwood was economically important from the 17th to the 19th century because it was used in Europe for coloring fabrics. We're talking about blackwood or Campeche tree, which is a native in southern Mexico. The Spanish crown claims sovereign territory over large extensions of the American continent. Despite this, English, Dutch, and French sailors recognized the value of logwood and illegally set up camps to cut and collect the trees for shipment back to the old continent. Spain periodically tried to scare away the log cutters, who were then out of work and frequently joined pirate crews to raid Spanish colonies in return. Dampier's portrait of how the work of cutting logwood was done with much detail, as we can see.
Some fell the trees, others saw and cut them into convenient logs, and one chips off the sap, and he is commonly the principal man. And when a tree is so thick that after it's logged, it remains still too great a burden for one man, we blow it up with gunpowder. The logwood cutters are generally sturdy, strong fellows and will carry burdens of 300 or 400 weight, but every man is left to his choice to carry what he pleased. And commonly they agree very well about it, for they are contented to labor very hard.
These men have their own lifestyle and ways to interact. Dampier says, for instance, that
when ships come from Jamaica with rum and sugar, they are too apt to misspend both their time and money. If the commanders of these ships are generous and treat all that come the first day with punch, they will be most respected, and every man will pay honestly for what he drinks afterwards. But if they be stingy, they will pay them with their worst wood, and commonly they have a stock of such laid by for that purpose.
Dampier's importance then resides in the fact that he circumnavigated the world 3 times, and during these travels wrote down information that is valuable until our days. His book, A New Voyage Round the World, was a bestseller, presenting the observations of a naturalist, including quite exact ethnographic, biologic, nautical, and topographic data. It also allows us to take a peek into the life on board of ships and the overseas colonies at that time. The part about Campeche is, without a doubt, crucial for understanding the history of piracy in this area. Dampier's work influenced many important figures, such as Alexander von Humboldt and Charles Darwin. Several natural landmarks in New Guinea, New Zealand, and Australia, as well as an asteroid, carry the name Dampier. There's also an Ecuadorian stamp to honor him, as you can see, And he's depicted as a pirate with a pirate ship in the whole thing.
Now, the last explorer that we will present to you today is James Cook. The first thing we need to clarify is that this chronicler of Yucatan was not related to the celebrated British explorer Captain James Cook. The James Cook who came to Yucatan was an officer attached to the British Navy in the West Indies, and he was also a spy. In 1765, he wrote a 34-page long report about the mission that brought him to the Yucatan, crafting a text that allows us to take a look at life here in late colonial times. Our James Cook, he was born before 1750 and died after 1800. More information is not available. As a young Navy lieutenant, Cook came from England to Jamaica in the early 1760s. One of his first assignments was to sail to Belize, then a British illegal settlement. According to the historian Matthew Risto,
at the time, Belize contained only a few hundred British settlers known as baymen, outnumbered perhaps as much as 10 to 1 by the African slaves. They were scattered in logging camps up the region's 3 main rivers, with a more or less permanent base at Belize town. The formal classification of the settlement as the colony of British Honduras was still a century away.
When Cook was sent from Belize to Merida in 1765, he came officially to deliver diplomatic correspondence to the Spanish governor, but in reality, his assignment was to observe and evaluate the military defenses of the Yucatan coast and of Merida concretely. His notes show a concentration on matters of military and naval strategy that also pay attention to whether the Yucatecan natural resources could serve British interest. To understand this type of endeavors, we have to remember that they took place during the Age of Empire, at a colonial frontier between 2 powers. The British were occupying illegally Belize, and after the 1754 expulsion of loggers from Petén, were actively looking for other areas to settle. Since Yucatan appeared to them as a good option, they sent Cook to Merida to acquire an informed assessment of the peninsula's accessibility and defense, or lack of it. The route James Cook followed, you can see it here, initiated in Belize City, went up the coast to Bacala, to then cross northwest through mainly unknown territory to reach finally Merida. He completed his trip in March of 1765 and submitted his report shortly afterwards to Admiral William Burnaby. In London in 1769, it was published under the title Remarks on a Passage from the River Belize in the Bay of Honduras to Merida, the capital of the province of Yucatan in the Spanish West Indies. Continuing with Risto, who has studied in depth the case of James Cook, he noted already that although in later centuries spy reports would become a specific genre in text and other media, at the time of Cook's, they were barely a little more than a letter written by an explorer, merchant, or priest to a senior administrator. Nevertheless, they certainly were important for policy and decision-making as Europe's empires competed against each other for new lands overseas. We can very well see this in Cook's writings. For example, after praising the beauty of the colonial buildings in Merida's downtown area, he highlights that the city has handsome arched gates, but without doors. The military eye can also be identified clearly, as he wrote about Merida's citadel, which does not exist anymore. You can see a plan of the citadel here. This was the seat not only of the military power, but also housed the convent of San Francisco. As you can see in this actual map, the citadel was located in the southeastern part of the city's central area, where in 1887, the Mercado Lucas de Galvez, or Mercado Grande, was opened to the public. Here it is marked with the name Ciudadela de San Benito.
The citadel or castle is in the form of an hexagon with salient angles, with light pieces about 4 and 5 and 6 pounders mounted, some brass, some iron. The wall, about 10 yards high, has no ditch or outwork. It is by no means in a condition to defend itself against any foreign enemy that have artillery.
And about the strength of the defense forces, Cook noted,
a company of foot do duty in the citadel and at the governor's house, but a troop of horse, which are parked here, and the rest at Campeche, escort the governor when he goes out. I was credibly informed that there was not 500 troops in the whole province.
The search for revenues is also present in the writings.
There is but little appearance of commerce or any mechanic art in Merida. Very few public shops. Many Spanish live on the small profits of a plantation and that cultivated by the Indians. But there is a small trade causeway from the port of Sisal to Campeche in beeswax, leather, copal, ebony, and logwood. But this a stranger cannot immediately discover. The revenues of the province come from the province to the crown of Spain are very considerable, arising mostly from the article of cotton which the woods abound.
Travelers' accounts about Yucatan during the 18th century are really rare. So therefore, Cook's report allows us to take a glance at late colonial life in Yucatan, and this is its value.
This way we come to the end of this first presentation dedicated to travelers in Yucatan, and we concentrate on the time before Mexico became an independent country. You're going to see the list of sources here. If you would like a copy of it, please contact the Merida English Library and they'll be happy to send you a PDF.
In our next lecture, we will introduce you to other interesting explorers that visited the peninsula from 1810 until the beginning of the French intervention in the 1860s. So we thank you for your attention.
And now we're going to move on to the question and answer session, and I'm going to stop this presentation so that we can see you all. This is the best part. Hello. Good to see you.
Okay.
Good to see you. Good to see you all. Okay, so we are ready for questions that you might have. You can, if you have a question, you can just use the raise your hand button. Okay, Andrew. Hi, Andrew.
Hi, Max.
Hi, everyone. It's so nice to see so many friendly faces. Andrew, could you please unmute yourself?
Yes. I was wondering what were the interactions like every day between the Spanish in Merida, in this time, with the Maya in the, in the little more of the country,
Okay, during the colonial time.
Yeah, you do. Colonial time.
Colonial time, okay. Okay, during the colonial time, those Spanish that had encomiendas or ranchos live in direct contact with most of the Maya people in the sense that they were, sometimes they're workers, sometimes they were their neighbors, sometimes they were their suppliers. But there were also relationships. Yucatan is one of the states where a miscegenation started relatively early. So you will find many compadrazgos. So I baptize your child and then you baptize mine. So this closer relationships occasionally too. In the cities, the Maya people also lived in the city, in Merida, in Valladolid. Actually, there were the majority of the population. The Spanish were just a few. This was a very small number of Spanish people here in Criollos. And they were all over the city. There were vendors. They were also workers. So there were many opportunities of interactions. Yeah. Yes, Ken.
Hi, Alma and Stephan. Wonderful job. It's great to see you again.
So good to see you, Ken.
From all of these accounts, I didn't hear anything comparable to something like Bartolomeo de las Casas, who was at least somewhat sympathetic and against the conquest in his later years. Did you come across in this early period anything in the Yucatan that indicated that anyone was speaking out against the conquest?
No,
No.
no, so far, no. You find descriptions, much interest in their architecture, nature, what's going on, but no voices that question the way that the way Spanish were abusing the Maya and were taking over the country. We haven't run into that.
This came later than the 19th century.
Yeah, and actually maybe a little sooner too, no? Maybe already by the, around the
actually
time.
with Humboldt. More
With
or less.
Humboldt, right, with Humboldt. So a little later, but not during colonial times. No, even the priests who came here were very interested in pushing the agenda, no, more than in questioning what was happening.
And
Yeah.
was there any, just as a follow-up, was there any kind of indication that there was resistance by the Mayas as they were being conquered? I mean, I know they battled, as you mentioned, but later on, once it was pretty established that they were done, was there resistance that popped up?
Yes,
Well,
there.
just because first it was, you have to see that it took the Spanish more than 20 years, not even to conquer, but to be able to stay in Yucatan, and only in very small places, in very small regions. Yeah? The rest was not touched by the Spanish, and because of the resistance of the Maya. And now you come with the Canek.
Actually, there were several revolts. The Canek revolt was the most important one.
In 1760s.
Yeah. So there were many revolts. The Maya were not happy with the way they're being treated, but the Maya also developed strategies to sort of be able to stay, in the sense that whenever they saw Spanish and they felt abused by the Spanish, they left. Se fueron al monte, dicen, no? So they escaped and they lived somewhere for some time, and then they came back. And by then the Spanish couldn't figure it out and couldn't be there anymore. So it was a passive resistance, but also an armed resistance. Yeah.
Good, thank you.
And that's why they survived. Yeah. Miriam, yes? Miriam, and then two more people. Yeah.
Okay. Fray Diego Delanda, was it a one-person decision to burn down all the books, or was it forced by the Spain government?
Well, that's a tricky question, because officially it was, what he did was not allowed. That's why he had to stand trial in Spain. On the other hand, as an acting bishop at the time, he could do whatever he wanted, more or less. Yeah. So, and he was a very stubborn character, and if he wanted to go some way, he went this way.
And then Conven, I'm sorry, I'm mispronouncing your name.
No, it's Ben con Ben in Espanol.
Gracias. Okay.
Well, thank you very much. What an educational talk. I'm so grateful for it. But I'm also very curious about how the British ended up keeping little Belize surrounded by the Spanish, and how different was their attitude or treatment of the Mayans, and if you can expand a little bit about that. Thanks.
Just one sentence. This will be part of our next lecture, the base question, but
The least question, yeah. I was going to say the same. Historically, we need to go a little farther in time, so that's for the next presentation. If that's okay, Ben.
I'm jumping ahead, and I'm eager for the next presentation. Thank you.
It would be great if we can do it live, wouldn't it? Well, the hybrid model, because we're very modern now. Okay, Bob. Oh, we cannot hear you, Bob.
Bob, you're
Now,
muted.
got it.
No.
Did you come across anything about this gentleman called Cabeza de Vaca in your research? Did he ever make it to the Yucatan?
no,
Cabeza de Vaca was not here.
no.
No.
This was
Mhm.
almost exclusively South America.
Mhm. By the way, there's a film, a Mexican film about Cabeza de Vaca that was shot probably, I don't know, 20 years ago, which is interesting. If you're interested, I can find the reference for you. Mhm. Any other comments or questions? Okay. Ken, maybe these last two? Okay, Ken, and then okay, Ken.
I just when you talked about the burning of the codexes, which Cortez did that as well, and they all the Spaniards did that. It's interesting that globally, this has always been the first thing that gets destroyed by the conquerors, the colonialists. Even a few years ago in Bosnia, the first thing that went up in flames was the famous library in Sarajevo. So I think that's something that, and it has been talked about and written about, but the idea of destroying culture and language as a first foundation stone for conquest and genocide. The Spaniards probably were one of the first to understand that as a way to control the people.
But Ken, there's an important point that Delanda didn't start like this. This action, this auto da fe, came later. He was already there for several years, acting as bishop. And there was also one bishop before, and they didn't do that. So it was him after, it took 20, 30 years after the so-called conquest that he started this. So it was not the first reaction on burning books and getting all these idols and destroy them. It was actually later, not at the very beginning.
What took him so long?
Probably the resistance of the Maya.
Mm.
When they saw that they were just not getting through and they were not submissive and they were not going to go away, they started cutting them on all sides. No? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, Miriam. Yeah, Miriam had a question too. Uh-huh.
Yes, the William Dampier, he had this successful book, and that was translated into German, right?
Yeah.
We saw it.
Yeah.
And it was a very, very early translation. So there were already a market in Germany for books from this kind.
Yeah.
Obviously, yes.
Yeah.
But it's hard to find such an early copy because it was done just 6 years after he published.
Mm-hmm.
So the translation was already out in German.
Yeah. Actually, Miriam, as an interesting detail, some of the most successful printing companies were in Augsburg at that time, really? Around that time, really? Yes. If you go to the library of my alma mater, University of Augsburg, ask them to see the old print collection. Mm-hmm. They have this beautiful, for the time, for what we consider here colonial, so 1700 prints there.
That's where we stole the book.
Yeah, we stole. No, it's not true. It's not true. No, we don't do those things. Okay.
Just one very short question. A cacique, what is a cacique?
Cacique.
Cacique, a leader.
Okay.
A Maya leader. Yeah.
Okay.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Well, I know that we cannot go too long because this video has to be then uploaded to different media platforms, so it cannot be too long. But most of us are in contact anyways personally because we know each other. So any questions that you might have, please send us a message. Another way to reach us is through the Merida English Library. Any questions that you might have, or maybe you think about it later, you say, what about this? Please send a message. Yeah, and please donate to the Merida English Library.
They really need it.
Yeah, and it's an important part of the community. This is why we do it. No, we believe in them, and we like their work. And hopefully the next lecture series season we'll be able to meet in person. And if not, we'll do it online. We'll figure it out, no? Like Dampier, no? Left in Sumatra, in I don't know which island. Figure it out. We'll figure it out too. Okay. So
Well done.
Okay.
Well done.
Gracias, Marilyn.
Okay.
When is the next lecture? Is there a date?
It's not even written.
March 10th. Oh,
It's not even investigated, so it will take some time.
It's our work for the following year. Thanks to you, our brain
this
cells
year.
remain
Then I
remain
have to
active.
wait for the answer to my question. I'll contact you directly. Thank you very much.
Sounds good. But Bob will organize it, no problem. Okay.
thank you.
Thanks so much, Alma and Stephan. It was
Thank you.
fascinating.
Thank you.
Tom.
Bye to all of you.
Tom is there.
Where's Tom?
Tom, my brother-in-law is there.
Wow.
Bye.
Hello.
Okay. Can call you later.